Hello, folks, and welcome to Israel Explained. Let's start with the most important thing. It is opening day for baseball. But unfortunately, this podcast is not about baseball. So let's talk about the big news coming from Israel. The entire country is in shock that the Supreme Court has stopped funding for yeshiva students of military age. Why shocked? The court has said repeatedly that eventually it would have to take this step over the years, but it's been giving years and years of extensions on this, 25 years of extension, telling the government, telling the Knesset to pass a law about this, and it hasn't passed. And I think the Haredi parties in particular, Netanyahu as well, felt that they could just keep delaying it and put off a decision, but finally, the court has forced it on. So what does this all mean? A stay was decided on by the Supreme Court forbidding the Treasury from funding yeshiva students that are of conscription age. That means ages 18 to 26. Uh, at age 26, according to Israeli law, anyone who has not served in the military doesn't have to serve in the military anymore. So it's 18 to 26. What does that mean? There's 180,000 yeshiva students on the books funded by the Israeli government. 56,000 among them are of this age, 18 to 26. A large percentage, but not even close to a majority. That doesn't mean that yeshiva students who are older than 26 will stop being funded. They're currently not touched by this, although in August, their funding may run out too, unless there's a government decision otherwise. That should probably be a little bit easier to settle because it's less of a fundamental issue than Haredim of conscription age. Now, yeshiva institutions that will not have enough money to survive as a result of these cuts will be given a minimum in order to survive. So the law does not permit and does not demand the closing of any institutions, just that the funding of individuals who should be in the army according to Israeli law will no longer be given. The idea behind this from a legal standpoint is very simple. Anyone at that age is supposed to be in the army. Right now, the government is paying people to break the law. There is no law that is exempting them from service. Therefore, this should stop. Very simple. The court decided on this 25 years ago, but allowed the government time to work this out. Since then, there's been one extension after another. The last extension was given in July 2023. It was a temporary allowance from the court not to draft Haredi men. The extension was until April 1st, 2024. The court finally said enough is enough and are not granting another exemption. They gave fair warning to the government that they don't actually think they will give another extension. And the Israeli uh, Attorney General agreed that an extension should not be given. She was not willing to defend another extension because, legally speaking, they're on very shaky ground. Now, it's important to note the court was getting very impatient going into the massive political crisis that Israel underwent in 2019 2022, when there were several elections in a row and the government didn't function. But once that ended and there was a stable government, the court decided things had to change and that that extension would be the last one. Now, why were there all these extensions to begin with? That's because this is an insoluble problem almost on a political level. There's no law allowing all these Haredi individuals to avoid serving in the military. What there have been is government decisions allowing that. And government decisions have limited authority and temporary authority. The reason there's no law is because the Haredi parties want a law giving full exemption forever for these yeshiva students, and most secular Israelis don't agree that that should happen and see that as a travesty. Most secular Israelis believe that everyone should serve in the military. So putting together a law one way or the other would strongly alienate core constituency in Israel, and that's why every government has put it off until now. Um, One of the other things that's changed recently is the IDF used to say, we know we don't need these soldiers, we have enough soldiers. They're not saying that anymore. The IDF has lost about 6,000 soldiers in this war, whether to deaths or injuries, psychological trauma, etc. There's about 6,000 soldiers who were serving who are no longer in commission. They can make up for that with people who are coming into the army soon, but not enough people are coming in because a lot of people are exempt from going into the army. The IDF has said that it has a shortfall of 4,000 soldiers, and it would like to see that shortfall made up by Haredi men. Therefore, the army is no longer backing this compromise. The army wants the status quo to change. That wasn't true a few years ago. Of course, the Haredi community is gassed by this and have vowed to fight. Goldknopf, who's the construction minister from United Torah Judaism, said, quote, "We will fight in every way for the right of Jews to study the Torah, and we will not compromise on that." Indeed, some elements in his party, Torah Judaism, that's the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, are saying that they will demand a law protecting the right of yeshiva students to study Torah instead of going into the military should pass, or they will leave the government. That's not the official position of the party yet. If it becomes the official position of the party, it will be very difficult to keep them in. The other ultra Orthodox party is Shas, the Sephardic party. They have always been more um, willing to compromise on this issue. And while the United Torah Judaism all these years has tried to get that law passed, the Shas party has asked for extension after extension, realizing that it's too dramatic a step to be taken against the will of secular Israelis. They might be regretting that strategy now. We'll talk a little bit about what Shas is doing in a second, but Netanyahu and the circles around Netanyahu have been talking to the Haredi parties, and their message has not been particularly conciliatory. They've basically said, quote, "You have nowhere to go." They want the Haredi parties to stay in, but they're having a lot of difficulty passing a law. The level of um, objection to that among the average Israeli to passing that kind of law would be so high, Netanyahu would be committing um, political suicide. So many of his supporters would abandon him if he did this. There's just very little support for the continuation of this exemption outside of Haredi circles in Israel, including among very right wing people. Now, I think that the Haredi parties are not going to leave the government. That's a bit of a hot take. A lot of people are saying otherwise. Things are very much up in the air, but I'm seeing some indications of that. Arya Deri, the head of Shas, said that after having the same kind of vitriol towards the decision as United Torah Judaism did, has said that he will talk to the rabbis about whether to stay in the government or not. But he did say, quote, "I'm not certain. We will give those who are oppressing us the gift of dismantling the government," end quote. And to me, that's certainly an indication that Deri doesn't want to leave the government. I think that they can find a way to stay in, both parties, but especially Shas, by blaming the Supreme Court for this, talking about the Supreme Court as anti-Semites, all that sort of stuff that they already do. Supreme Court's already hated by their constituents and by the right wing, and build the case that it's not the government's fault, it's not Netanyahu's fault that this happened, it's the fault of the Supreme Court, and that way they can stay in and try to get a law that's better for them passed, although that'll be difficult while Gantz is in government. So I think that's what dairy, and possibly United Torah Judaism are going to do. Now, this isn't the end of the story. All that happened now is the court has decided not to keep funding institutions. They haven't ruled or decided on the principle of drafting Haredi men. In May, the court is going to talk about those issues, and the state will have time to prepare an answer. Of course, the state's had a lot of trouble preparing answers because the Attorney General of the state of Israel, Gali Bacharav Meira, doesn't agree with the position of the government on this. She doesn't think that it's legal to continue this exemption. So they might have to try to work with her. If they can come up with something with her, some kind of position, or draft some law by then, they may have something to stand on. But in May, unless there's a convincing answer or law proposed by the government, the Supreme Court will probably say that all Haredi men need to be drafted. And that will already be more difficult for the Haredi parties to deal with and stay in the government. Although, again, not impossible because they can blame the Supreme Court. The state will definitely bring up the exemption to Arabs as a precedent in their attempt to argue. But I'm not sure how much water that will hold because, according to law, Arabs don't have to serve. That was a decision that the Israeli government made because they feel like it would be a security threat to the state of Israel. There isn't a similar arrangement with Haredim, just an unofficial one, and various government decisions, not legislative ones. So I don't think the Haredim are leaving the government right now. I think they're going to be able to stay until the hearing in May and hope that the government come up with an answer. There's no reason for Gantz to leave now because there's movement towards what he wants, which is to see the Haredim drafted. So this will actually freeze, I think, the government until May. And in May, it will once again come under very intense pressure. Ultimately, I'm not sure that this issue can be solved. I think the stress that it puts on the coalition is probably something that will force Netanyahu at some point to choose between going the unpopular route and legislating with the Haredim or going the more popular route and supporting the court and going with Gantz towards a more secular coalition. Both of those options are terrible for Netanyahu for different reasons. He doesn't want to be dependent on Gantz. He doesn't want to have that kind of unpopular law passed on his watch. So he will do what he does best: delay, 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 and hope to keep things together. Kind of similar to the way he's fighting this war as well. But that's what happens when all you're trying to do is survive instead of make important decisions. And we really should point out that the reason this has come to this crisis is because Netanyahu has been in charge for a very long time, most of the time since 2009, and has refused or been unable to resolve this and so many other important questions on the Israeli agenda. Okay, I have a bunch of questions. All of them are, of course, about Rafah, because that's what we were talking about before. Still a major issue, and something that I talk about endlessly on this podcast. So let's answer those questions. DIH466 says, I think that your explanation that Netanyahu is risk averse and refuses to commit to a day after plan is one of the main reasons that operation in Rafah hasn't occurred. And yes, that is without a doubt one of the major reasons that this hasn't happened. Netanyahu is risk averse in the sense that he doesn't want to confront the United States by going into Rafah, and he doesn't want to not go into Rafah and be considered, a wuss by the extreme right wing in his party. So he'd rather just threaten to do it without actually doing it. Once again, delay, enjoy the best of all possible worlds. 51 Ringside 3 says, I'm not sure what to make of the accusation that most Gazans are on the cusp of starvation. I mean, towards the beginning of the Israeli offensive, we kept hearing about how the hospitals were minutes away from losing power, and we all know how that turned out. Secondly, if in fact there's a real threat of severe food shortages, Is that truly because Israel is not letting in an adequate amount of food, or is it more a function of inability to adequately distribute it? Lastly, if it's a distribution problem, is it the fault of Israel? Does Israel have an adequate plan to distribute the food? Okay, a lot to unpack there. So, as far as starvation is concerned, it's hard to separate the propaganda from the reality. It really is. But I've tried to do that. I've talked to Israeli sources, people on the ground, etc. What I'm hearing is that in the north there is genuine starvation. In the south there are serious shortages. And the reason there are shortages in the north is because Israel doesn't really control the area there, and Hamas doesn't really control the area there. So, um, corrupt elements in society, clans in particular, basically glorified small warlords at this point, are taking the food for themselves. Israel isn't willing to risk its soldiers in order to make sure that it's distributed. It's not willing to allow an international forces to do that either. So we do have a serious distribution problem. Is it the fault of Israel? Yes, it pretty much is. According to the Geneva Conventions, an occupying power, which is what Israel is, certainly in the north, has an obligation to feed the population. And, international humanitarian law is designed to protect people who are um, have no protection, like the people in northern Gaza. So there's really no excuse, legally speaking, for Israel not to do that. And morally speaking, Israel has to do that. And if it's not going to create an external power situation, it's not going to allow the Palestinian Authority and not going to allow international forces, and no one else can do it, and Israel has to do it. Does it have a plan? Yes, it has a very good plan, but it hasn't been willing to enact it because there isn't really the political will to put Israeli soldiers' lives in danger in order to distribute food. So there is an obligation Israel has, but also a reluctance, understandable reluctance Israel has in doing it. Israel needs to overcome that and distribute the food. People's War asks, my question has always been why wasn't Rafah taken as the first step of the operation? Early defeating and destroying Hamas in the remainder of Gaza, to say nothing of rescuing the hostages, would have been much easier without the cross border tunnels of resupply and human trafficking. Typically, militaries move to cut off enemy supply lines as part of offensive operations, so why wasn't that done here? Great question. So, in retrospect, I think it's pretty clear that the first thing that Israel should have done is, along with, not instead of, going into Gaza from the north, the city of Gaza from the north, the first thing that it did, it should have gone and cut off the Philadelphia route, the border between Gaza and Egypt, and made sure to secure it, stop tunnels, stop arms from coming in, etc. And then we also wouldn't have the problem that we're having now with Rafah and the refugees. The reason that wasn't done is because there was concern over Egypt's reaction. There was an attempt to work that out diplomatically that didn't work. That kept getting delayed, and as usual, Israel didn't want to make the hard decision of taking it over. Over the last month and a half, the US has put increased attention on it too. At first, it was Egypt mostly pressuring Israel not to do it, and it would have been easier for Israel to overcome just Egyptian pressure. Now it's American pressure too. So again, it was the unwillingness to make a hard decision and delaying it, a Netanyahu characteristic that caused this problem. Noam Shapiro asked, I understand and tend to agree with your critique of BBRE diplomacy with the US. Don't you think it's a bit hyperbolic to say the diplomatic window has closed, which I said in the last episode? Sure, as you say, there's now tension, but at the end of the day, munitions are still coming in, and America is not making any statement explicitly calling for an end to Israeli operations. So, Noam, your opinion has aged a lot better than mine. A couple of things have changed since then that have proved you right and me wrong. Um, First of all, Hamas said no to the latest American proposal in such a way that it became very hard to tell Israel not to pursue military operations. And there was a general readjustment of American policy to give another chance to Israel to come up with a plan in Rafah that would adequately protect the um, refugees living in Rafah temporarily. Also, Netanyahu, and I didn't think he would do this, reversed his decision and sent the delegation back to DC. So the window has not closed. The window is open a little bit. Israel, if it's smart, can climb in. It's lost opportunities like this in the past, but you're right. The window did not close. Okay, so that's it for our episode for today. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon. Follow my podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast, where I'm working on the third part of my series on the 12 tribes of Israel. And I'll see you here next time when incredibly dramatic things occur.